Indeed, urgent and important news for Ukraine was announced today by United States Vice President J.D. Vance. According to him, the United States is ready to provide Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine. For weeks, the Russians have refused to negotiate with Ukrainians and Americans, showing a complete unwillingness for peace. In fact, today, for the first time, the United States publicly stated that Putin does not want peace, which is why Ukraine will receive Tomahawk missiles to force the Kremlin to negotiate. At the same time, Russia is massively attacking Ukraine with hundreds of missiles and drones, deliberately and demonstratively striking specifically at the capital of Ukraine. NATO says security guarantees for Ukraine are already prepared. This is causing a real hysteria in Russia. Lavrov, for example, is already openly threatening Europe with war, Lukashenko is threatening to attack Poland, and Putin is shouting about fighting until victory. Let's analyze together in this episode the motives behind the sharp change, first and foremost in American rhetoric towards Ukraine. My name is Alexei Pechi, today is September 28th, and before we start this episode, I want to remind you that every day on this YouTube channel, several news and analytical segments are released so that you can stay up to date with absolutely all the news. That's why I recommend subscribing to this YouTube channel, giving it a like, and writing any detailed comment under this video. In addition, if you want to support the work of this YouTube channel, you can do so through donations using the links and details in the description of this video. It says right there, support the YouTube channel. Alexei Pechi, choose any format that is convenient for you. I will be grateful for any support from you. So the position of the United States of America regarding Russia's war against Ukraine has changed dramatically. First, we heard a statement from Donald Trump that Ukraine can win the war and reclaim all the territories seized by the Russians. Trump began to criticize Putin more loudly and even in some ways mock him. He said Putin has sacrificed hundreds of thousands of Russians without achieving any battlefield success, not to mention achieving the strategic goals of this war. And today, United States Vice President J.D. Vance, probably the loudest critic of Volodymyr Zelensky and Donald Trump's team, suddenly makes a public statement while the Russians are sabotaging any peace efforts. As J.D. Vance stated, Russia refused bilateral negotiations with Ukraine and even trilateral talks involving United States President Donald Trump. However, as J.D. Vance said, Russia needs to wake up and recognize reality. And just listen. J.D. Vance believes that the situation on the ground has changed. In particular, the Russians are killing a lot of people and suffering huge losses themselves, but they are unable to achieve significant progress on the battlefield. As Vance stated, the Trump administration still seeks peace, adding that steps are needed from both sides to achieve it. However, Russia has publicly refused to negotiate. Next, I will quote J.D. Vance. Unfortunately, over the past couple of weeks, we've seen that the Russians have refused to hold any bilateral meetings with the Ukrainians. They have also refused any trilateral meetings where President Trump or another member of the administration could meet with the Russians and Ukrainians. The Russians have refused to engage in dialogue. And this quote from J.D. Vance is important because for the first time, the Trump administration publicly stated that it is the Russians who are disrupting any peace initiatives from the United States president. It is the Russians who are refusing to negotiate. And it was the Russians who simply betrayed Donald Trump, who, I remind you, had invited Putin to Alaska. The United States vice president also emphasized that the Russians need to wake up and accept reality. He reiterated that Russia is taking heavy losses with almost no results. Another quote from J.D. Vance, "We have actively pursued peace since the beginning of the administration, but the Russians need to wake up and accept reality. A lot of people are dying, they have nothing to be proud of. How many more people are they willing to lose? How many more people are they willing to kill for very little, if any, military advantage on the ground? I think the answer hopefully is not that many." J.D. Vance reiterated that the United States will keep working for peace. And he expressed hope that the Russian Federation will eventually wake up and realize the reality on the ground. And here I want to make an important remark. Today I noticed that some channels, some journalists have already started. J.D. Vance expresses indignation over Russian losses and stalled battlefield progress. As if the Russians were capturing Ukrainian lands, that would suit him. But I have to disagree with such bold statements. I always draw your attention to the little things. Watch from the beginning. Last week, Donald Trump said, quote, "When people living in Moscow and in all the big cities, towns, and regions across Russia find out what's really happening with this war, it's nearly impossible for them to get gasoline due to the long lines and all the other things happening in their military economy, where most of the money is being spent on fighting Ukraine, which has great spirit and is only getting stronger. Ukraine will be able to restore its country to its original state, and who knows, maybe even go further." That is, Donald Trump's message was that the Russians simply don't fully understand the scale of the tragedy. And now J.D. Vance continues, quote, "Russians need to wake up and accept reality. A lot of people are dying and they have nothing to be proud of. I conclude that these Trump administration statements are now directed specifically at the Russians. Like, yeah, you're dying, but you can't capture anything. This is a dead end, wake up already." But then J.D. Vance made a simply stunning statement, which is also addressed to Putin and the Russians. The United States is discussing the possibility of supplying Tomahawk missiles to NATO for transfer to Ukraine. However, the final decision will be made by President Donald Trump. Quote from Divans. "You asked about the Tomahawk, a question on which the final decision will be made by the president. Let the president speak about this, but I know that we are discussing this in the White House right now. Trump will act in the interests of the United States, and this is the main principle underlying his decisions in foreign and defense policy. We will apply the same principle when answering the question about Tomahawk missiles. In general, these are no longer just leaks or even hints from the Ukrainian president. This is now Trump's team's clear official position. The United States is ready to provide Ukraine with Tomahawk missiles because Trump supported Ukraine's retaliatory strikes against Russia if it continues its attacks on peaceful Ukrainian cities. Russia itself is raising the chances that Tomahawk missiles will be sent to Ukraine. Because on the night of September 28, Russia launched 595 drones at Ukraine. Ukraine neutralized 611 out of 643 targets, including 48 missiles of various types. The main direction of the strike was Kyiv, and there were 5 missile hits and 31 attack drones recorded at 16 locations, plus the fall of downed debris at 25 locations. Moreover, regular residential buildings, hospitals, and energy facilities were destroyed. For example, in Kyiv, besides residential buildings, the strike also hit the Institute of Cardiology, which treats children. And after this horror, the Russian Ministry of Defense offered a cynical justification for the large strike on Ukraine, claiming it targeted military objectives. And finally, I'll quote the Russian Ministry of Defense. "Last night, the Russian armed forces carried out a massive strike with long-range, high-precision air and sea-launched weapons, as well as attack drones, at a Ukrainian military-industrial complex facility used in the interests of the armed forces of Ukraine, as well as at military airfield infrastructure. The targets of the strike were achieved. All designated objects were hit." As they say, draw your own conclusions. I'll leave it at that. Be sure to share your opinion in the comments under this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.